welcome you all here this evening for this symposium in celebration of the completion of Sarah Cameron Sunde's extraordinary artwork, 36.5, a durational performance with the sea. This event has been long in the planning. We originally were going to do it in September 2020. And then, like everything else, it was put on hold. Sarah herself, however, was not on hold, never is. And she used those intervening years, I think, to make the project so much more interesting, to develop really thoughtful and deep roots in the place and the community in which the final performance was to be held, and then was held. So beautifully, and so many of us were there, and it feels really terrific to get an opportunity to be together here again to talk about it. Among the people who were part of Sarah's community are many NYU faculty, and I thank them so much for their support and for bring the work to their classrooms, to teach about it, talk about, write about it, and for many of them to be here on this panel. I've got so many people to thank, so I'm going to speak a little quickly, but the two most essential people, well, just almost as essential as Sarah, but not, maybe just a little less, are Jay Mueller from the Dean's Office, and Ryan Rosenberg, my extraordinary graduate assistant, and they're both just rock stars. Ryan has taught herself all kinds of things while getting ready for this, including what she's doing right now, which is projecting a gigantic, very large-scale video of the performance on the west wall of Bob's Library. So after this event, it's going to go on for many hours. So after this event, be sure to swing by there and stand around and take a look at that. I also thank Professor Yao Nyarko and Africa House for their support. Rebecca Portnoy, our Director of Communications, from Skirball Center, the director, Jay Wegman, and assistant director, Jada Leon. From NYU Arts, Pamela Tinnen, who is lead curator for Kimmel Windows, and who created the beautiful installation about 36.5 that's out on the windows of this building. And so please be sure to check that out as well. For this beautiful space, I thank Karen Nersessian, Associate Vice Provost, as well as from Stern, who own the space, Neil Rader and Diana Daniels, and Martine Gomez. Again, I thank all the faculty members, including the faculty of XC, and their director and assistant director, Jennifer Jacquet, and Laurie Cole, who've been working with me on this project for so many years and have been so supportive. And just such fantastic colleagues to think with. Laurie Cole is the best partner anyone can have in anything, and Laurie has partnered with me on this event, and we're going to divide the moderating duties. So I'm now going to turn it over to Laurie, who will get us started. Please welcome Laurie Cole.
Thank you. Thank you, Una. It's wonderful to be here. I'm Laurie Cole from XE, and I'm going to start by just telling you a little bit about the format and what to expect tonight. So first, we're going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and talk about the piece in relation to their own interdisciplinary or theoretical backgrounds and interests. And then we will have a conversation amongst the panelists, after which we'll invite Una, Sarah, and one of Sarah's collaborators onto the stage to speak briefly, and then we will also field questions from you, the audience. So thank you again for being here. So I want to start by just asking each of you to tell us your name, your department, and tell us initially some of your thoughts on how you approach this piece, some of the questions it raises in relation to your own work. And we're going to start with you, Hannah, and then work our way this way.
Okay, so my name is Hannah. Oh, should I use the microphone? Yeah. Is this on? Yeah, okay. My name is Hannah Friedthal. I'm an associate professor in the Department of French Thought, Literature, Thought, and Culture. And I work on 20th century literature, environmental humanities, queer and feminist studies. And I just actually finished writing a book about the beach, in which I make a case for the coastal zone as a surprisingly generative site for 20th and 21st century literature and art. So although 36.5 is titled A Durational Performance with the Sea, I think of it as a work that's staged on the beach. And from this point of view, I think it's a performance that implicitly critiques the leisurification of the seashore, even as it plays on the idea of what it would mean to do nothing. And it also harkens back in a collectivist, ecological, and decolonial way to the longer history of this space as a medicalized phenomenon or a site of cure. And finally, as a scholar of modern European and American literature, I read 36.5 in relation to a number of 20th century beach set works, and especially works by Marcel Proust, Virginia Woolf, Rachel Carson, Claude McKay, Samuel Beckett. And so I see Sarah's work as kind of an heir to those experimental works of literature. And yeah.
Hello everyone, my name is Sebastián Calderón Bentín and I teach theater studies in the drama department, and my work focuses on performance and theatricality and how it reproduces the state. It was interesting in the performance that at one point the NYPD boat kept coming and leaving the presence of the state making itself felt. One of the things I thought was so productive and generative in terms of the performance was the way it was giving us a model and a lived experience of play as a way to engage the relationship between the human and the non-human. And by that I mean a relationship with the ocean itself and the movement of the tide, but also all sorts of other non-human forms that entered into the play, such as the geese, the wind itself, the rustle of the leaves. And so for me that became a kind of key proposal of the performance, is to think about play in this way, and also to think about play in a way that enacts a kind of making by not doing. That is to say, there was something in the stillness and what the stillness opened up for those who then went and stood as well, where the play activity revealed itself rather than the play activity being made, no? So this aspect of using play as a mode of emergence between the human and the non-human, I thought was one of the central proposals of the piece. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. I have other things, but I think we'll open up as well.
Thank you very much. My name is Elizabeth Strovic. I'm professor of German, and I mainly work on German literature from the 19th century to the present, with a special emphasis on poetics of knowledge, psychoanalysis, literary theory, eco-criticism. And now what can I as literary scholar contribute to the reflection on 36.5? And I would argue that Sarah's performance is illuminating various theoretical reflections on the Anthropocene, which might be useful in turn for analyzing the performance. So let me illustrate that with respect to the term scene, which comes from the theater and is widely used in literary theory. With respect to the relationship between theater and climate change, Una has coined the term Anthropocene, and my considerations here are following up on that. I regard the scene as a way to model and rethink ecological relations. We might speak of a scenic ecology here, which at the same time requires an ecological revision of our understanding of the scene. In a traditional sense, scene refers to a framed setting, a stage on which figures make an appearance. The figures are bearers of action, which takes place in scenic surroundings marked, for instance, by a backdrop and sets. Let us now imagine an ecological revision of the scene. That is, let us think about the scene from the perspective of the surroundings, the environment. The chorus or the ancient Greek tragedy can serve as an orientation here. With its reference to the outside, the chorus comes from the outside, it comes from the countryside, right? The chorus is a decidedly ecological figure that generates the scene as an environment. What I propose here as ecological scene is not a framed setting that separates the inside and outside from one another, but instead transgresses such a framework as a scene of interconnectedness. Inside and outside can be differentiated from each other just as little as figure and ground. The ecological scene is distinguished by a crisis of figure and ground. In other words, it cannot be detached from the environment. Correspondingly, action is not connected to a figure or a protagonist, but is instead generated based on a constellation of heterogeneous forces. The ecological scene is a setting of force. Human agency is not just one agency among others, but also cannot be detached from non-human agency. And this is exactly what I see in 36.5. 36.5 creates an ecological scene. The force underlying the setting is the tide, that is, the rise and fall of sea level caused by the combined effects of the gravitational forces exerted by the moon and the sun and the rotation of the earth. 36.5 is thus a planetary scene as well as a local scene. It's not possible to speak of protagonists. Sarah is just as little a protagonist as the sea. The sea is basically the rising and the falling, i.e. it is a force, a movement, slow motion, that keeps the scene in incessant motion, in constant change. Sarah's durational performance suspends any dramatic events so as to bring forth ever new constellations of human bodies, natural forces like the tide or the sea, the city and the geese and the seagulls. In a flat ontology, or better to say, a flat ecology, the body does not enter a scene but is instead engulfed by it, engulfed by the sea. The agency inherent in 36.5 is a dynamic constellation of human and non-human forces. One of the questions that is thus raised by Sarah's performance is which ecological, political and ethical models of action can be derived from such an assemblage. And I'm pretty positive we'll address some of these questions here.
Thanks. Hello, everybody. I'm Martin Daughtry from the music department. Sarah, is that you? So, okay. You and I have never spoken. I just want to thank you, and I'm just overwhelmed at the surreality of this, event where I'm sitting on this stage, telling you what your work meant to me, and in order to really tell you what your work meant to me, I think I'd just have to use my 2 minutes being silent because it really meant a lot to me, more than I can really express. But I've been asked to talk to you about how, as a music scholar, from the standpoint of music studies, I approached your work. I work, among other things, on the auditory imagination, which means the sounds that we hear in our heads. And so when I'm standing with you knee-deep in the East River and the voice of the Marxist philosopher Henri Lefebvre makes itself manifest to me, I'm going to pay attention. My ears perk up. Lefebvre, before he died in 1991, and the last book he wrote was this crazy little book called Rhythm Analysis. And in that book, he was obsessed with rhythms. And he wrote this phrase, which I've always wanted to put on a T-shirt. He said, "Nothing." You can insert the French accent, if you, or maybe not. I'm looking at Emily after here. Why would I say that? "Nothing inert in the world, no things, very diverse rhythms, slow or lively, in relation to us," he said. So what the book kind of laid out was this understanding of all of us, you, me, everyone, as this concatenation of rhythms, slow ones, respiratory ones, cardio ones, synaptic firings, the slower digestive ones. But he also kind of stepped it out into built space and ecological space. So as a music person, I think about rhythms. I think about how rhythms kind of need to be need to be kind of incorporated into our bodies in order for them to go to work for us or go to work on us. And I felt your piece as being this a piece that was kind of poised, you know, involving. It was kind of connecting corporeal rhythms with ecological oceanic rhythms and measuring oceanic time on the body, on your body, on our body. And I am just amazed at how profound and multi-tentacled and wild and moving an experience that was.
Hi everyone, my name is André Lepecki. I'm professor in performance studies and I work in critical dance studies, and therefore I'm extremely anxious talking about dance in front of Sarah. I feel like I echo Martin here and talking about your work. And my work is mostly around the conditions of possibility of choreographic imagination. Choreography is a very specific thing in the history of the West. It's an art form that captures dance that always existed in the social realm and puts it into some kind of enclosure environment. The first book that actually prints this word choreography, it's a French book from the 18th century by Raoul Auger Feuillet. It's called Chorégraphie. So it's the first time that this new word appears, this neologism. And what's interesting in that book is that the first image is not of a dancing body, but it's actually of a square, thinking about Henri Lefebvre on the production of space. So it's an empty white square, and it's the room or the theater in which dance takes place. So in thinking about dance and movement, I'm teaching right now a graduate seminar on movement and politics. And one of the things that I wanted to bring to the students was actually, how can we imagine a dance that doesn't take place in a space that is fixed, planar, and creates the illusion that actually a dancer is just like this solid that is moving on a stable spatial temporal grid, right? And I was thinking, like, well, how can I think about this? How can I think about the fact that everything is already in motion, including the ground? And all of a sudden, it's like, Skirball, 36.5 is happening in this river. And this was perfect because, in a way, this was the first day of class. We all sat together in the little beach on a little bit further south. So there's a little tree. And with us, we brought two books. We brought Edouard Glissant, Poetics of Relation, and we read The Open Boat. And we brought Christina Sharp's In the Wake. And we read from that book the chapter, The Ship. And both of them interrogate and interpolate something that is profound, I think, in relationship to your work as well, which is from a sentence by Derek Walcott, the poet, right? Thinking, the sentence is, the sea is history, right? But when we think about history, what kind of historiography can we write on the sea if the sea is the sheet of paper on which this history is going to be written? There will be no trace. Or the traces that will appear in the sea will be different than the ones that will be actually written on the ground, right? Because it is not only ephemeral, it's absolutely liquid, right? But in that liquefaction, liquefaction, I don't know how to say this word in English, there are elements of a history, right, that informs particularly the Atlantic Ocean, which is the history that Glissant tells, that Christina Sharp tells, which is the Middle Passage, right? And when we got there, we sat under a tree, we were reading Glissant, and looking at your body, like allowing yourself and allowing the bodies of others to be within the wake of those waves, made me think also of another aspect of the work, because Sarah's work not only takes place live, and that's very important, but I feel like I wouldn't call them documentations, right? There's something else. They're art objects in themselves. And there's a very poignant one that I think echoes also this North American version of it, which is the one that took place in Bahia de Todos os Santos in the state of Bahia in Brazil, which received a large majority of the enslaved populations that came from Africa to Brazil, the 5 to 6 million enslaved people from Africa to Brazil. And there, I felt like the way in which all of a sudden, because we think about like the tide is going up, but it's not just about the tide, it's about the way your body is overtaken by the tide, actually. And there's no stillness possible there. You just enter into this motion of the oceanic, right? And I felt like this is a moment in which I saw Glissant's poetry actually being performed. And the best way to say it's like it's actually to be quiet, to be the homage that I have to give to you and to all that are with you in making this beautiful work. So thank you.
I don't want to have to follow that up, but I will. Thank you, Sarah, for the work. I am learning a lot from these various perspectives, and I am myself a professor in the Department of Environmental Studies, but I work largely at the intersection of natural science and social science when it comes to sort of marine ecology and also with climate change. So the piece was also right up my East River, as they say. And I think, to me, I never thought standing in the East River would mean very much at all. So it was really interesting to see how much it meant and how your piece brought so much meaning to the East River. I think to stand in the East River is to stand in the Anthropocene. There was a lighter, there were plastic bags, there were police boats, but there was the built environment of New York City. And of course, there was the rising tide and also the background noise of climate change. So you can't help but ask sort of what have we done? And I think what struck me just as an individual there participating with many other individuals was the different amount of risk that people felt comfortable with in terms of even standing in the East River. And of course, the risk that you were willing to embody and put your sort of body in the middle of. And the idea that you were willing to stand still, in this kind of meditative state for 12 hours to sort of deal with that in a way. And you had to wear a wetsuit, right, because you can't stand in water for 12 hours and survive. And all of that also brings to mind, the way that activists and artists put their bodies in the middle of things, often to elicit meaning or in just a kind of maybe even a kind of impulsive way. And I thought about Paul Watson, who really he jumps on the back of this juvenile sperm whale and launches basically the international environmental movement with this Greenpeace campaign in the 70s. Or I think about Greta Thunberg, who's removing her body from school and sitting there in a kind of meditative Friday after Friday after Friday kind of way. And I think just figuring out how to put your body in the middle of the Anthropocene, which is so big, so incomprehensible, is just something that really, really struck me as powerful and meaningful. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. So it's important, I think, for us to talk about this both as an artwork and as a kind of political provocation, and to think about its characteristics along both of those lines. But to start by thinking about it as an artwork is already a difficult or kind of slippery task. So I'm curious to know what you think the medium of the work is. I think of water and the body as both these media of obsolescence in a way. And as Andre mentioned, it's not just the experience of the artwork, it's also its afterlife or its virtual experience. It has these different layers. So it's also hard to pin down what the site of the artwork is. It's site-specific, yet also multiple. What the scale of the artwork is, its time or space, if it's art or theater or dance, as we've talked about. The qualities of stillness versus movement, the sounds of the work, and the choreography that's been mentioned as well. So I want to just start by thinking about what kind of art this is, and if we can answer the question of what the medium of the work is and what that means. And you've all touched on this a little bit in terms of your different approaches, but I don't know if you wanted to add anything. Hannah, would you like to start? You don't all have to speak each time.
I'll wait for a minute.
Okay.
Maybe I can take up the point of scale, right, which you mentioned, and when reading the special edition which you edited, right, of resilience, I guess in your article, Sarah, you mentioned 3 scales, right, at which you perceive your performance, and the one is the monumental scale of landscape art, right, and the other is the individual bodily scale, right, of the performer, and then the third one is the digital scale of the video art. And I was just struck by the notion of scale, since thinking of the Anthropocene, which you just mentioned, Jennifer, there's a lot of interesting theoretical work recently done on the question of scale, right? Be it scale critique, be it scale effects, and I guess what is the decisive point when speaking of scale in the Anthropocene is it's not about the what we all know from Google Earth, right? So a homogenization of space and time, right? So where we can transition between times and spaces as if homogeneous, right? So this is exactly not the point, but it's about the heterogeneity of scales, right? How can we perceive of scales as incommensurable scales, and how can we think human agency, right, in these different scales? And I think your performance very beautifully, right, brings together this or articulates this heterogeneity of scale, because you bring together the planetary, right, with the everyday, right, or with the local, or the really the slow moving tide, right? I don't know what time that is, right, with the now. And this was really struck for me to see how beautifully you also address something like maybe a deep future, right? A rising of the sea level where we are no longer present but rather absence. I think the absence is part of your performance when it comes to scale. I guess, yeah, I have a question for you later. Right.
I have a thought on temporal scale, maybe, and that is that, okay, so you began this piece when? 2013. And it concluded when? Right. So, you know, I think this is actually something that is a kind of a banal point, but something that is true of every single performance, that you can initiate a performance. A performance can begin, but no performance can ever really truly end. You know, particularly if we're thinking environmentally, if we're thinking about, you know, kind of, we can imagine the continuation of every performance materially in terms of, you know, disturbances to the environment, you know, to the atmosphere that are created and then continue on, and we can think about it in terms of resonance and memory and everything. So it's pretty easy to make a very kind of precise beginning to a performance, but it's really impossible to actually corral that ending, which gives us this kind of, you know, image of like a palimpsest of just this ever thickening, you know, with every performance kind of thing. And I think your piece really kind of doubles down on that unendability of you know, of this thing that began very precisely in 2013. So that's one thought. But also Jennifer mentioned, you know, how could you find this, or you know, that you managed to find this place of standing in the Anthropocene, and I think that's really deep. I was struck by that comment, and about how your piece enables me, and I think a lot of us, to realize that we are standing in the Anthropocene right now. We are standing, you know, we are no less immersed in, you know, the kind of ecological time and the kind of sick arrhythmia of climate change than we were when we were standing with you in the East River. So that too causes scale to kind of, you know, come apart a little bit and get a little messy.
Can I say something about, I really like the question what kind of art it is, because it's impossible to answer, but it's interesting to think that it can be a poem, it can be a music composition for the ocean and the geese, and the banging that happened on the rails, right, and the wind and all of that. One of the students in that class actually thought that it was possible to create a kind of weather forecasting. It was kind of an oracular performance also about the future to come. But I'd like to think as dance, actually. And if you think about as a dance piece, I think there's something that happens that is really interesting in terms of the task of the dancer. Because usually the task of the dancer is the one who listens to a choreographer's desire and executes the best this person can that desire, that plan for the performance. There's a sentence by Yvonne Rainer, the choreographer, and which I really like, and it's kind of a desire that she proposes in 1966. Like she'd like to be moved and moved by something rather by oneself. And I think like this desire is very hard to get when you're a dancer. But in a way, like the way you offer your body to the forces of the planet, because actually to the forces of the cosmos, because the tide is because of the sun and the moon and all that. Somehow I feel like you're being moved by these things, right? And in that sense, I feel that there's something that happens in terms of a definition of dance that is very, very interesting. So I'd like to think of your work as dance.
Does anyone else want to add anything? Sebastian?
Yes, I also like this art question. That's why for me it was about play, because it gets us out of the art object and into the relations that emerge. But you know, theatrically, of course, for me, in talking about scale is the position of the lookers onto Manhattan, you know, at a very kind of representational level. And I mentioned this in my message. You know, Manhattan really becomes a concrete allegory of extractivist modernity within the performance. Now, you were staring at extractivist modernity in the way that the performance is figuring Manhattan at that level of scale, no? But at a more non-representational level, it really is, for me, all of the relationships that emerged in the dynamic. People coming from New Zealand that I was also able to speak with, people coming upon the performance by accident. And so I think, and of course the relationship with the geese and the wind throughout and the tide, and all of these things start to create a kind of fertile ground of relations that, as I mentioned, start to emerge. No, they're not made; they emerge, and the performance allows for that emergence to take place. And so, in that sense, for me, it does have a work of a kind of prefigurative politics, that it's offering a politics that is non-directional. Not oppositional, non-Oedipal. No, I attack the state or I attack this, but actually another kind of politics that embraces a kind of non-directionality that also borrows the sense of politics also from the non-human. No, what does it mean to enter the politics of time of the ocean, for example? No, so that's what I find really comes to the fore. No.
Yeah, if I can just jump on that. I think without being able to answer the medium question, which is too hard, I think, for this work. But yeah, no, one of the things that I find so fascinating about The Water's Edge is, well, there are two things. One is that it's the site of ultimate transience, right? The materialization of transience. Rachel Carson called it the most transitory feature of the Earth. And secondly, that it's a commons or potential commons or a kind of precarious possible commons, right? And specifically, you know, in the US it varies by state. In many places in the world, the intertidal zone is marked off as unprivatizable. And of course, everyone is always, you know, the rich people are constantly trying to say that you can't go on the beach or whatever. But in the US, you actually you're allowed to stand at the low tide line at least, right? In every state in the country, and in some places higher. So it's so interesting to me that that's the space that you occupy in this performance. And I think it's a space, it is a collective space, it's a space of improvisation, it's a space of political possibility, and I find that part really interesting.
So the two of you already touched on this, but I do want to think about this in relation to activism and what it asks us to do. How does it mobilize our bodies to political ends or not? And what are its policy implications, if any, if that's something we can even ask? And, you know, what is it? I mean, I think the word ethics came up, and also the idea of stillness and nothingness and doing nothing. But how that opens up a new frame or new way of thinking about these different political implications, because the work is very beautiful, but it's also very mournful, and you know, really, as Jennifer was saying, asks us to think about climate change very viscerally. So I'm wondering if anyone has additional thoughts on the kind of political dimensions of the work and its relationship to the audience in particular.
Well, I mean, I will say that I guess a question I would have for you, and that time may come, but is, and it was very obvious then when I participated as well, that the futility of any individual action politically, whether it's trying to stop the tide or, you know, there's just a kind of, you know, a kind of feeling of nihilism that you can't help. You can't help but feel that humans were so powerful. You're staring at Manhattan. You're looking at all the plastics. You're like, we have done this, and yet the individual, I haven't done this. So that question of scale, and then I think political responsibility, how that falls out of it was definitely part of the work to me. But I don't know how to answer your question exactly.
You know, I find the work really moving, but also like quite hopeful. I think that's the experience that I have of watching your body, you know, disappear and then reemerge. And it's that reemergence that feels, it's a kind of hope. You know, ecological thinkers are very interested in the problem of hope. Like, how can we have hope when, in a sense, there's no possibility of you know, of stopping what is happening, but it just strikes me there's something about the resilience and the endurance. It, you know, it reminds me of Anna Singh on Patchy Hope, which is a hope that is aware of catastrophe but still imagines possibility, and so that's it's not it's definitely not policy. I'm not the person to answer the policy question, but I find it more hopeful than not, even though hopeful in an intransitive way, like not hope for a specific thing.
Elizabeth, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Since I guess the term which comes to my mind is exhaustion, right? I don't know. And this again has to do with the temporal scale, right? And as with all durational performances, I guess exhaustion is part of that, right? On the part of the body of the performer as well as on the part of the beholder. And I was wondering to what extent the exhaustion, I don't know, provides for a different ethics or for different. Certainly aesthetic practices come to mind, right? When it comes to the durational, to the exhaustion. And I was wondering whether this is part of an ethics or of a new way to explore interconnectedness. I don't know. This would be a question to you, right?
Actually, I was thinking about also exhaustion, but maybe just to turn a little bit. Because I think there's something that happens at the level of endurance. You're talking about the question of the political. To endure is actually one of the main characteristics of the political actor. You have to initiate, but you also have to endure the initiation that you just begun, right? And I think like there's something about this endurance that lingers after the performance because we're still energized by it. I cannot deny the fact that your performance will stay with me, would linger with me, and will actually allow me not to feel exhausted, but to feel, as I said, full of energy. And if hope is a category of mobilization, I feel there's something in that, it's not stillness, in that co-movement, quiet co-movement with the ocean, and with the others, that actually creates another image of what a political movement might be. And I think it's super important right now to think what a political movement might be, so that we don't fall back into this notion of the kinetic heroism of modernism, and create another kind of maybe affect around what is the political. So I wanted to say that. And the other thing about scale, and also has to do with exhaustion, when we talk about long durational performance, indeed, like, usually we associate with things that take a long time according to the clock. It took 12 hours, so oh, that's long durational performance. But I think there's another way of thinking about the word duration, and I tremble here before so many scholars in French studies and all of that, but Henri Bergson, right, proposes this notion of duration precisely not as something that can be measured by the clock, but as a mode of being that enters into a deep relation with the vibration of the forces of the world, that allows me actually to step outside of myself and fall into that vibration, if you want. And in that sense, at that level, it is impossible to feel exhausted. I don't want to be exhausted. We're not allowed to be exhausted, I feel, in this political moment. And I feel like there's something that the energy of the ocean teaches, which is to say it's inexhaustible. So that's what I take from it. It's another kinetics for the political.
It's very beautiful. Thank you. Martin, did you want to add something? Or?
I'm not sure it's a good idea. I'm going to be honest. I had to leave early. I wanted to stay to the end, and it wasn't because I was exhausted. It was because I just felt this overwhelming urge to flee from you and everyone at the event that I still don't quite understand. I was trying to figure it out, and my friends and I in the music department have this amazing colleague. He's a Huelmech Stalo Squaw artist and writer named Dylan Robinson, who teaches in Canada. And he wrote this book called Hungry Listening that was, it draws critical attention to exactly the kinds of modes of listening that are the ones that I teach in a music department, right? This kind of voracious, like how do music people teach their students to listen? Harder, deeper, more. Like suck all the juice out of the shell. And that kind of consuming of the artwork and close reading it, and like all of those operations that I've spent my entire life kind of immersed in. Dylan was pointing out that it's not that that's never appropriate, but that there are within the indigenous communities that he is embedded in, there are songs that are not for me. There are songs that are not for you. Some songs are not there to be consumed. Some songs are or to be close read. Some are acts of historical witnessing. Some are assertions of land rights. Some are simply sacred. And so it has engendered in me, working with him and listening to him has engendered in me this a new humility that I'm kind of taking around with me to these different artworks. And I found myself thinking about that in relation to your work, and feeling very palpably at a certain moment that this work was not, I was kind of in it, but it was not for me. I felt all of these, dramatic and fascinating objects, the tinkling sound of the shards of glass. Talk about Anthropocene, like the waves kind of kicking up on the East River, just making this delicious little jingle bell sound that I, as a music person, am like, sound, right? I could feel everything kind of withdrawing from me, and kind of like the geese, kind of taking off, and I felt, so I don't know how this comes back to politics, but I felt myself overwhelmed. I felt myself in such proximity to the abyss I felt like I needed to withdraw and get away and think about it. And I'm going to be thinking about it for a very long time. And it's probably a very bad idea for me to be talking about it in a public forum with recordings before I've worked it out. But that's I want to feel hope.
This brings me to another question that I think is really important in relation to this work, which is the emotional effects of the work and the kind of affective range of the piece. Before physically participating in it, having participated in it virtually and read about it and watched documentation, I found the tone or valence of the piece to be very joyful and playful and defiant, this kind of collective energy. And then being there and physically participating, it felt much more mournful and elegiac and sort of had the experience of a prayer or a ritual, also very collective, but a very different tone. And so, you know, clearly the piece encompasses all of this, but I'm wondering how we make sense of this range of the work, what the implications are for that distinction in terms of thinking about the piece itself and its possible afterlife or experiencing it in these different forms. And also just how we reconcile that emotional reaction with all of these theoretical interpretations of the piece. So I don't know if anyone else wants to speak about their own experience or how they've thought about the emotional effects of the work.
For me, this is tied also to the politics because rather, I think the political contribution to the piece, more than hope, is wonder. And the thing with wonder, as opposed to hope, is that wonder is always relational and concrete with something. Something is activating the wonderment. And for me, that capacity of wonder, you know, first I thought a re-enchantment, but let's get more practical. And I think it's about this sense of wonder that I think speaks to what Andre was talking about as a kind of energizing wonder that can be also a political, have a kind of a political energy to it as well, no? So I don't know if wonder is an emotion, but definitely I'm reading that feeding into the collective that the piece does at that level, at least for me, no? Yeah.
Martin?
I like wonder. That feels good. Jack Halberstam wrote recently about bewilderment, which I think is kind of connected to wonder. Bewilderment, in Jack's telling, was, you know, it has the word wild in it, and it has to do with, you know, etymologically with feeling like you are lost in a wilderness, in the same way that astonishment is, you know, this old word that is the feeling that you get when you've been hit in the head with a stone. Like that's where astonishment comes from. And so bewilderment comes from being lost in the wild. And bewilderment can be, trying to think bewilderment in politics is an interesting thing, right? It might just be a productive step, you know, in you know, a kind of a radical defamiliarization that is necessary in order to kind of cut your ties with unproductive, you know, politics that are weighing you down. I'm not sure, but I think bewilderment is an interesting term to kind of think through with this piece.
I'll just add, I mean, just in terms of affect and again, my own experience, but when I got tenure in my department, I jumped in the Hudson and I tried to make it a departmental ritual, which my other departmental members refused to partake in because they said the Hudson's too gross to jump in. And again, I come back to this idea, you know, there were some people that didn't want to go in the East River, and this is where we live. This is the waterway right by where we live, and I completely understand. I mean, it's inadvisable to go in the river. And it to me, again, that question of scale where you're confronted with something that is ordinarily a beach scenario, very benign, And it's like, this is actually a risky move to walk into a very shallow body of water right where I live in a, in a very wealthy country. And so, it felt to me sort of the same feeling that I have when I fly into New York, which is this kind of bewilderment about what have we done. Was that feeling of just like walking into the river is something people are going, I don't know, like maybe not. And I'm sure it varied among the different places where you went, but here it felt very pronounced.
I was eager to embrace the revoltingness of the East River. I was sorry I couldn't stay longer, and I found it fascinatingly gross. I mean, I'm interested in what the trash was like in all the places, Sarah, that you where you stood, because this is obviously one of the striking features of seashores is that they are dumping grounds and rubbish-filled places, and so that was, I think, that was part of the experience, and I think we have to kind of embrace, part of being ecological thinkers is also embracing the revolting. I feel this way about compost, but you got to do it, right?
I have one more question, which is about the kind of collective nature of the work and thinking about the body and multiple bodies and audience, and thinking about being activated and being invited into the piece and interpolated in different ways and across different locations. And this happens in so many different ways. When that, Elizabeth, you mentioned is this idea of the chorus, which I think is really interesting. We also maybe touched on this idea of the human clock, which I loved, and was a really different kind of experience of the piece and of time, and this idea of perhaps witnessing the piece, witnessing the Anthropocene, and so many other things. So I'm just curious to know if anyone has thoughts on the body, either singular, Sarah's, your own, or the collective, and collaboration, the kind of collective experience of the work, what we make of that.
Maybe, but this goes a little bit to the question, of the medium, right? So I want to switch away from the performance, which I can't apparently, to the video, right? So I guess, and I unfortunately wasn't able to go to Queens, but what I did over the course of the day was basically taking endless screenshots, right? So I did that, and we just talked about that in our class on Monday. And what is striking, it's a sort of a collective, right? So because it's an iterative structure of the performance, right? And for a number of hours, I guess 4 hours or so, what was done was a superimposition from previous videos onto the live streaming, right?
Current video. That was actually current.
Say that again?
It was current. It was simultaneous performances happening.
Oh, it was simultaneous. Okay. But still, okay. But it had a sort of, okay, first it was again working on scale, right? So you had basically the video brought together landscapes and human figures of different scale, right? And it had also a spectral notion, right? So I would just like to raise the notion of spectrality as part of this collective, right? Be it with terms of a temporal notion or the iteration, right? But this seems to be part of the collective thing, the spectral notion.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of haunting quality.
No, I'll just say briefly, the piece would be totally different if it were the single person standing. The collectivity really, I think, is central to it, and the invitation for people to come and for people to decide when they come, how long they stay. Really that distribution of agency becomes kind of central, to the piece as well. So I think, as you were bringing up also the chorus, that the centrality of the collective, and to think about what is a collective, in the process, without offering an answer, but just putting it in that place of that collectivity, both there in the beach, but also that global collectivity too, at the same time. Yeah.
guess I would bring it back to rhythm for me in the end when I think about the collective. So music people and dance people know that rhythms contain kind of secrets that have yet to be disclosed. You know, secrets about your bodily capacities, and secrets about the collective, secrets about what happens when a collective becomes entrained into a rhythm, into a single rhythm. So, you know, on the dance floor, that entrainment can, you know, produce wild collective euphoria. If the rhythmic entrainment is taking place on a bridge, it can pull the bridge down. You know, there's all this sort of power that the collective entrainment to rhythms holds within it, and you don't know what that power is until the entrainment, you know, the collective begins experiencing the same rhythm together, and experiencing the simultaneous rhythmicity, like the eternal moon pull rhythmicity of the tides, along with this arrhythmic rising thing together. You know, I don't think we know what the collective is capable of when it begins in training to those two rhythms. And you know, I see your piece as, I feel your piece as a like an experiment in that vein. Yeah.
Is there anything anyone wants to add that we haven't touched on, perhaps, before we shift to the next part of our conversation? I'd like to invite Yuna and Sarah and Sarah's collaborator to come up on the stage.
Sarah, Kimigichi, please come on up. There are those two chairs there for you. Okay, well, gosh, thank you all so much, and thank you, Laurie, for creating that, you know, fabulous exchange of ideas and questions. What we would love to do is we're going to give Sarah a chance to first introduce her collaborator who's visiting, and invite him to contribute a little bit to the conversation. And after that, we'd like to open it up to everyone to continue the conversation with Sarah, with Kimigichi, and with the rest of the panel. There may be things that was said that you'd like them to follow up on. I also want to say, this is not just about asking questions. We would also love your comments, because I know there's so many faculty members here who have been teaching this work, and students who've been studying it. So, you know, don't feel that you just are in the questioning mode there. So Sarah, I turn it over to you.
Sure. Hi. This is one of the most amazing moments of my life. I'm like all these incredible scholars talking about the project, and I'm just like, and Yuna putting this together. I'm incredibly moved and humbled, because you know, you make work and you hope that people feel it, and so actually hearing people talk, really smart people talk about how it worked, and works in different ways is just really special. So thank you for all your scholarship and deep thinking about it, because it really feels successful, because you know, like I can feel like we did it, you know. So yeah, thank you. So I'm just grateful to be here and to hear all your thoughts, and I did make it for you, Martin. I did. I made it for all of you. So with me, I'm really so lucky to have Dr. Kimigichi Wabende, who comes from the University of Nairobi. We worked together. He was one of my core collaborators in the Kenya work, 36.5 Bodo Inlet, and is really kind of the the reason that we landed where we did in Bodo. And he was supposed to be here for the performance on September 14th, along with some of my other international collaborators, but the visa was delayed. And so we were like, we'll come for the post-performance activities. And what's special about that is that Kimigichi then was, while I missed him, having him here by my side, it was great that he was able to actually co-lead the simultaneous performance that was happening in Bodo Inlet on September 14th. So if any of you watched the live stream, you were actually, when you were seeing Kenya superimposed, layered onto the video, that was actually happening live, and Kimigichi was there leading that. So I will pass it over to him and to give you some thoughts.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. I think it's interesting to have listened to my colleagues. Scholars have a way of, even when you're just walking ordinarily, they see something unique, they see rhythm in your walk, they see something special, spiritual in it. And it was interesting to listen to all of you have those perspectives. I would like to perhaps focus on the issue of spirituality and culture in the context in which the performance was done in that community. I think when Sarah came and spoke about this, it equally troubled me because I was going to ask permission from the university to go and attend the event. And every time I explained to them what we were going to do, they say, "Oh, you're going to stand in water. How is that a performance?" And that question doesn't seem to ever go away. Even my friends up to now have that picture of Sarah standing in the water in my office. And they say, "Oh, that you are the ones, those ones who are standing in water for 12 hours. So it is something that was hard to explain, and I kept thinking about it. And in my view, when I went for the event at the coast, Kenyan coast, the community seemed to have provided the answer for me more than I had thought of it from my own perspective. There are two communities that neighbor the Kenyan coast. There's the Digo community, and then the Shirazi, who are assumed to have come from the ocean. So for them, they believe they are Muslims, and Muslims have a way of dividing the ocean as belonging to the spirits and the earth or the land to human beings. And that there's a relationship between those who live in, the spirits that live in the ocean and those people who live on land. Whoever wants to enter into the sphere of any of those, you have to negotiate before you enter that space. And that negotiation is almost ongoing every time. There are transgressions, and spirits come from ocean and enter human being, and they use them for certain purposes. Some are bad, some are good, depending on the spirit that comes. And in a way, that's why you find that people who live on islands seem to be very spiritual, because then they're surrounded by oceans, and the ocean is the land of, or the space for spirits. Therefore, they seem to be immersed in that more. For the Diko people, they avoid staying next to the shore, because that is the boundary between the spirits and the human beings. And for them, generally speaking, any water mass is a place for spirits. And the spirits, the strength of spirits increase depending on the size of the water mass. So therefore, a river will have smaller spirits or weaker ones. If you have a lake, bigger ones. And then when you have an ocean, then that is a really powerful element. So when we were explaining this concept to them, they seem to readily accept the idea more than I was accepting it. Because then they interpreted that, which is what oceanic scholars talk about, how the ocean is more fluid and open to the rest of the world. So you can see that for them, they see that ocean spirits do not have restriction the way humans are. You rotate within land spaces where your body can take you. For a spirit, it can be in the US and it can be in Africa within seconds. And it doesn't bother who it picks on. So they call the ocean spirits, what in Swahili would be wajomba, meaning your maternal uncles. Maternal uncles are said to have come from very far or anywhere. Your mom could come from anywhere. So the paternal ones are the ones who rotate around you. So they have Muindi, it means the spirit from India. They have Mwarabu, spirits from Arab land. They have any of the nations in the world. So they saw Sarah as someone who has been sent by an ocean spirit, and he had been sent to this area within that element. So therefore they performed one of the rituals which was central to it is what we call Kayamba. Kayamba is a healing ritual within the coastal area. And Kayamba is both a ritual and the instrument that is used during the dance. It's a shaker. I think Sarah has one of them. We forgot to carry it today. So if a spirit comes into you, then it's the Kayamba that is used to either appease it or remove it. So depending on what kind of, and this Kayamba also is, the spirits are so many. They can be ones connected with sexuality. They can be the ones connected with wealth, the ones connected with the environment, all that. So it was assumed she has the spirit, or she's a deity of the spirit of the ocean. And therefore the ritual accompaniment for her being taken to the ocean was escorted with a song that took her to the ocean and telling the ocean spirits, receive your own, and therefore she will be protected. So most of them were saying, it's not easy for you to survive in the ocean if spirits do not accept you. And if you survive, then you really have a strong spirit. So when we talk about bewilderment and wonderment, there was a lot of that. So that the first hour passed and then they say, oh, it means her spirit is really strong. She has survived 1 hour. And this went on until there were 12 hours. So by the time she left, there was already a strong belief that whoever these spirits are, they are strong enough to make her survive all those. So this kind of interpretation, I think, for me, who is normally interested in ritual performance and how they're used in every aspect, we saw the integration of a traditional ritual within this own performance. And the owl markings that were marked by the drum and the dances. And these dances were meant to cover almost every aspect of human life, whether it was a wedding, whether it was about the environment. And that was integrated to understand that within that context, therefore, the spirit can send anyone to protect the environment. And the sea as a shared resource that people anywhere in the world could see a sense of appreciation of this sea from whichever perspective you are looking at it. So eventually when I went back to my colleagues, I had figured out, I think from an artistic point of view then, as someone who does applied theater, how to respond to them. That the idea that they kept asking, it means how work had done what it needed to do. That it had brought, for people in Bordeaux, it forced them to look at the ocean for 12 hours, which we rarely do. Staying here for 2 hours is normally tiring enough, but you're thinking about people watching the ocean for all that. So that it was a connection already. By mere fact that up to now they still ask about it, it means they constantly now thinking about the ocean. And that's a human being as an artist, as an agent, has worked in that context. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kimiguchi. Thank you. I'm sure we're going to be talking more about that performance and the other international performances. So I want to open this up to you, and I think we've got microphones that will come running to you. Jay has one. Do you have? And Laurie, were you going to do the other one? Thank you. Yes, over here.
I actually had a question for Sarah, not so much about the performance itself, but its aftermath. I was hoping you could maybe speak about how your sensory perception maybe changed following this like prolonged period of time standing in the water. To speak to my own experience, I grew up on the coast of South Florida, another precarious coast that parallels New York in many ways. And I remember as a child, whenever I'd go swimming in the ocean, trying to like lay down for a nap after, I could feel the swirling of the water. And I was hoping you could just speak about your own experience.
Yeah, sure. I mean, in the direct aftermath, yeah, I think I don't know if I don't know. This last time was really weird because I actually felt like physically fine throughout. Usually there's been some physical challenge, like some reason why I might really fail and not make it through. But this time I was like, I think it was because it was the last time. So I was just like, okay, I got this. I feel good. I drank a really good smoothie that Bianca made for me. And and the water was not too cold. I was just like, okay, here we go. And so I have a little bit of a blank spot on a lot of what happened. Of course, I remember specific moments with the police boat and the geese and the Doritos wrapper and or bag. So there are definitely like moments that stick out for me, and I am really, when I'm out there, I'm definitely actively really thinking and working with my senses, and well, sometimes thinking, sometimes really trying to not think at all. And then, but take it in an embodied way that's different than how we normally, or I normally go about my life. And in the aftermath, I don't know. I mean, I always am very stiff, but this time I actually felt okay. I was like, I can walk out of here, no problem. But I feel the I guess the presence of the water is still with me and around me. Yeah, I don't know if that's a very satisfying answer, but it stays with me for a long time, of course, and is still with me in many ways.
Hi, I just wanted to quickly say thank you so much for making a space for us all to come together to talk about your art, because it's just such a unique piece, and I've honestly just never seen anything like it. So I just wanted to thank you about that. My question that has been lingering since I saw it about almost a month ago was, what if you do this, how do you mentally prepare for something that is so physically taxing and mentally taxing? And I'm just really curious what you're thinking about, if you are thinking at all, because I think it's so crazy to see you in person and hear you talk, because I feel like you're so lively. And when I saw you, I was like, you just seem like a statue. And I had no idea what your voice would sound like. So I think it's really interesting to see and hear you in the flesh. So, yeah.
I know. Yeah, it's interesting. I always talk about how, like, if I can do this, actually anyone can do this, because it's really not, I'm not an athlete, and I'm not I'm not a physically, robust person. I'm pretty normal, but I have this like weird mental obsession with actually creating this image. So that's why I do it, or why I've done it. No more, 9 is enough. So the biggest preparation is really about hanging out with the water and getting to know her and trying to just be with her as a being and getting to know the place, the site, and the people who occupy that space, and the more than human beings that occupy that space, and yeah, and then I try to like take care of myself and do some yoga. I had a really big hip flexor problem in Aotearoa, and so I was really trying to make sure that didn't happen again. And yeah, just trying to shrink my appetite a little bit, but eat well so that my body's prepared. But it's yeah, I'm not very good at disciplined routines, and so I actually sort of purposely, conceptually work to prepare. I like ask people what they think I should do, and that's what I do, and I try to follow instructions from people who suggest things, and yeah.
Actually, Sarah, can I ask you just to go on a little bit more on that and maybe give us some specifics about what you just mentioned, how you interact with the site, the community, and the elements of the non-human or the more than human world, and just maybe talk about this, the last performance, and what were the animals, what were the humans, what was the cultural surround?
Yeah, so, well, I had a lot longer time period with this go around because, as Yuna mentioned, the performance was supposed to happen in 2020, but then it got postponed by 2 years. So I had landed on this site, thanks in part to James Young, who's right over here, in 2019. And so I actually had 3 years of engaging with this place, and the one of the reasons why I loved it actually was the grittiness. It was like very New York, right? So you have water and there's beauty there, and people feel spiritually connected to it who come clearly, but then you have like rusty rebar sticking out of concrete just in the corner, and there's dangerous things sometimes on the shore. That's why you had to wear shoes. And so it so epitomizes New York in all its glory. And so I don't know. I actually committed when the project got postponed, I committed to making sure I was showing up at least once a month, usually 2 or 3 times a month throughout this all seasons, to try to really just understand how the rhythms of this place. And every time I was there, pretty much I would meet somebody, a person, or sometimes, and I would learn things. There was always something that happened, and so that. I guess that's part of what was so fun, was just I would show up and something would occur. Either like I met Garfield, who fishes around the corner, and he would show us how he does that. I met Bella, who's right here, who became like my right-hand person. I met, who else did I meet? I learned about the bloodworms that people go, and this guy once was like, I was like, what are you doing? He's like, I'm digging for gold. And I was like, what? What are you talking about? And he was digging for bloodworms, and which he sells, and that's how he makes money. And so there was just like, there were all sorts of things that would occur throughout the seasons. There would be different like forms of algae coming up, and seaweed, and so sometimes the tide would come in and be really high, and sometimes it would be low, and I would try to look at that in relationship to my charts, which I know, are just, I don't know, it's all tricky. But yeah, so it was just a constant interaction with all the beings and the stones, and yeah, the detritus, the built environment detritus. We would, one more thing, we would we developed this tradition of when we would do a cleanup, we would, with this group that formed out of this work called Kin to the Cove, we would look for treasures as we cleaned up, and then build a temporary sculpture that would live on the wall, on the seawall there. And that became a practice that was documented and was just a fun way of getting to know our fellow New Yorkers. Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. Other comments or questions? And also, I should remind the panelists that you're also welcome to ask questions or comment further.
Hi. I was wondering what your hope is for this work now that the project is over and we have the videos, and what would you hope for this work does in the world, or how does it leave its mark?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I hope that everybody who encounters it, that it stays with them in some way, and that it will stay in their body, and that something, yeah, I think that they just carry it with them. I think the performances are over, for sure, or my body being in the performance is over. I do anticipate that there will be more things. I think I'll be working with this material in some way for a long time, while I also go on and do other things. And I'm not sure exactly where that's gonna take me. I do really have a dream, I'm putting this out there in case anyone knows anyone, of showing all 6 durational video works at the same time in an enormous space so they can be projected large scale, 2 or 3 channels per video work. So we're talking about 12 to 18 channels. That's a thing I don't know when I'll be able to make it happen, but it will happen someday, because there's something about that collapsing of time and space in one room that feels really important to me. I think that's when I will feel really satisfied. But yeah, figuring out, letting it continue to resonate in whatever way it resonates is my real hope.
Actually, that dream performance, of the videos that you just described, we tried to do a version of that a couple of years ago in the Gallatin Gallery, and our hope was, this didn't happen, but that we would be able to, have the whole night, and in fact have a sleepover. So that people could come and meditate there all night. And we did do a version of that in another gallery.
Yeah,
right?
it will happen.
It will.
Someday.
Yeah. I just love the idea of a meditative sleepover. Yes, Wendy.
Hi, Sarah. I'm Wendy Lee. I'm in the English. Oh, hey, Ryan. Thank you. I'm Wendy Lee. I'm in the English department. This is Dipti Kira from Art History, and with these guys, we are in a public humanities seminar that also met at your installation and did the readings from Resilience, so thank you. I was interested where you were saying that it was hard to describe or hard to explain to your colleagues. It's just a person standing in the water. And Sarah, you had said somewhere that part of the success, you attributed the success of the project to it being so easy to explain. In the end, it is just you standing in the water. And so I was struck by the fact that also tonight you said that you're really just committed to the image, and that's what gets you, that is the result that you're going for. So in a way, it has stayed incredibly simple, even as it's been complicated by, the community involvement and the documentation. But, for these guys who are trying to create their own public projects, I think they're also thinking about how to start with a very, in some ways, simple experience, a personal embodied experience, and the process to becoming something scalable and shareable while at the same time, in the end, really being pretty simple in order to be compelling. So, and because even the 3/6.5, it's the felicity of that having been that half birthday marker that then sounds like it's you know, a calendrical thing is a coincidence that works. So anyway, just for us to hear maybe about that process and to reducing it in the end to the image.
I'll just say one thing and then I'll pass it over to you, which is I'm obsessed with the experience that image then gives people. So it is more complex than just the image, but I think it's true that at the end of the day, it's like I'm creating this spectacle, this frame for other people to have a thing to experience.
I think we were talking about this with Sarah just the other day. Like before the performance itself, Sarah is normally very keen on details. Like then on the very day, which I think was very meaningful to me, is the surrender to nature. She goes and stands there and she does nothing. So then you're leaving everything to nature. It's as if you're saying you're part of this whole system that operates, and there are things that take care of it, the way the sun rises every day without you doing anything, that you're saying, I'm standing there, so then everything will operate. And I'm just thinking about the ripple effect, that she, like a centerpiece, the thing that drops in the water, and everything else was left to other people to deal with it. So then, because even if you had to take, like for our performances, even if you had to just take 1 hour, it was a whole real performance because of how the hour was marked, what kind of dance was done, what meaning they interpreted within that one single hour, and or just idea of one standing in water for a few minutes. I remember my own experience of standing there, and I thought of so many things, some which I will not reveal because how you said you were afraid of, because then it made you just think about life, think about what you're looking at. If it's New York that you're looking at, you try to imagine what was there before these buildings came up. If it's the trees you're looking about, how long has this tree been here? What is it that it has seen? Like there are always many thoughts that were there. So you as an artist is just that thing that drops in water for the first time, but then what comes out, continue expanding. I think in Swahili, unfortunately, I don't know whether I can translate it right, but in a play called Kincheketili, someone says, Mtu huanza neno na neno likakuwa kubwa likamshinda. Like you start something, and then it becomes so big until it grows beyond your own control. And I think that's what Sarah has started. I see this as a movement that will continue cycling, and each one of you picks from wherever it is.
Yeah, also just to one other thing, in terms of how it's scaled up, you know, some of that is, and what I would encourage anyone to do, is just to like, for me, it was about listening and taking it slow and sort of letting the ideas marinate and then just being like, oh, well, if I pushed this further, where could it go from there? And really listening to the water's who told me I needed to do it in relationship with communities around the world. And so, yeah, I think it's just sometimes it's about, well, how would this manifest if it went to if I pushed it to its fullest potential? And that's the question to ask.
Hi, Sarah. So my question has to do with time, because I have two actual questions. I've been struck by how interesting everybody has been and how individually meaningful this has been. But I was also struck by the fact that the only person who used the word spiritual was Kim. May I call you Kim? And for me, much of what you were saying is in fact about a spiritual experience. But that's the vocabulary I use, right? So that's the first thing I wanted to say. And I guess the other thing dependent to that is what I would love to have organized somehow would be some member of every one of the communities where you did this come and speak to us about what was experienced there. Because clearly there's also some difference, at least in interpretation and words used, depending on what the community's history has been, depending on what their spiritual life is like, depending on many things. But I also wonder if you, having experienced time differently, can find that in yourself now at moments when you might need to find it. Do you live multiple times?
That's a hard question. Yeah, I mean, well, definitely every work and all the people, there are so many amazing stories and people I've worked with who, yes, would share. And we could do that someday, maybe, Una. Because, yeah, I personally love hearing my collaborators talk about it way more than I like hearing myself talk about it. Because I love hearing you all talk about it because that is actually what makes it so much more complex. But time, I'm a pretty agnostic person, but I do feel like there's some connection spiritually with just being in relationship with the planet in a different way and finding that. And I really owe it to my collaborators around the world for teaching me how to do that.
One thing I should add, Judy, in response to your question is, when we were first planning this event, to happen right after the last performance in 2020, the thing Sarah wanted the most was to bring her collaborators here. And that's always what she's asking for. And she managed to bring the people from Aotearoa here for the performance, and that was extraordinary having them there, because that was the only performance in which her collaborators accompanied her in the water for the entire stand. And I was very moved by that development. But we weren't able to bring all the others. We were able to bring Kimangichi. But, and of course there was, disappointment about that. But to me, the fact that you managed to organize those reenactments all over the world in the places where you had been. And this time, the stands were done not by Sarah, but by people who've embraced this project, who worked on it in various ways. In a way that feels so much more consequential. I know what you mean, Judy, about wanting to hear from those experiences, and I do think we hope to do a book, in which some of that would be documented or those voices would be heard. But I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, the reenactments, and the fact that there were 4 hours which coincided, 4 hours in which the people at all those sites happened to be standing in the water because the tidal cycle worked out that way. And that her collaborator, Attilio, managed to layer them onto each other in the live stream for that spectral effect that somebody was talking about. All that just felt like magic. I mean, we talked about wonder, but it just felt like magic, but it also felt to me like some kind of utopian, political gesture or, possibility.
We have 2 questions over here.
Yeah.
Hi, folks. I'll stand up because I can't say Una. Hi, Una. I'm Gwendolyn Alker. I'm also in the Theater Studies program in drama. And I also want to ask about time, which Judy was also talking about time. So I'm going to pick up on that. I spent a lot of time at the ocean in the summers. I live near the water. And there's a way in which the water slows you down. Like if you're present to the water, it shifts your physical rhythms in a certain way. And I'm also really struck, before I came to see your performance, but it was augmented by that experience, that she's like a tough taskmaster with the tides, right? The tides, they don't broker disagreement. They're up or they're down. The moon is in conversation with them, but it's not about you, you know. When I saw your piece, and I took my students, some of whom are here tonight, Chloe asked a question. When you look at New York City from that distance, it looks so slow and still. And what I love seeing New York City from that distance is we are able to step away from our own busy lives where we run around like little ants, and we don't think about the impact of our scurrying and quickness, which is kind of the problem in the first place, right, with global warming. Like if we'd all just slow down, have less stuff, it would be better, right? So I was struck by that in your piece, and I remember in some of the accompanying literature, you talked about, I think you said deep time. I think that was the phrase used. If I'm wrong, please correct me. But I was curious, you know, as a theater person, there's a lot of theater artists that reckon with durational performance, you know, Marina Abramovich, a lot of the more experimental extreme body art traditions. This is a very different extreme body art because your partner is the ocean or the water, and she's a different taskmaster than a scene partner or a space inside. You know, as you said, you're partnering with nature. So I just wanted to ask you, like, it's a little witchy, but like physically, like what does it do? How does the ocean affect, or the water affect your sense of time, like at that level of like your own individual rhythms? And I know you started to talk about that, but I'm just curious to hear a little more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think of time as nonlinear, and I also feel like it expands and contracts, and I feel like that on a daily basis. And then this is kind of the extreme form of that, where, yeah, I mean, it all happens so slowly because it's usually the performance has been painful, but it also happens really, and there's been a struggle, but it also happens fast because in the vastness of the world that I'm experiencing, and when you just let your body feel these things, it, yeah, things go very quickly. I mean, and it's interesting how many people who stood with me on September 14th have also told me that they had their sense of time was shifted, even in slow, in a short stand, and so I think that's kind of the power of standing still in a very busy place, and perhaps, yeah. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add to if they had any experiences.
There's a couple more questions.
Hi, I taught your 36.5 in my course, undergrad course on visual art and environmental activism. And so I guess I'm wondering if you have any advice for the next generation of artist activists on building reciprocal and responsive relationships with communities. I know you talked a little bit about it, but I'd love to hear more.
Advice. Well, because I didn't address it in the last question, I'll say actually deep time is so, I really think long-term thinking is really important to art. Of course, like being present is important, but I really think that we as humans many of us need to think in the longer term, in order to actually address what's happening now, ancient, and look at the past and look at the future in a much broader sense. And to listen, so much of this is about listening, and I think some of my biggest takeaways have been about and things I've learned, in theory from Una, especially about decentering myself as a human, decentering us all as humans, but then also really in practice from like my Maori collaborators, in terms of I'll just share that with this one thing that I am obsessed with, which is that in the Maori tradition, when you introduce yourself formally, you say first the mountains and the waters that raised you, and then because most of them can track their lineage for the last of what boats that their ancestors arrived on, they say the waka, the boat that their family, their ancestors arrived on, and then the iwi, the community, the tribe that they come from, then the site where they live, and the community that they live in, and then their family name, and then their first name. And to me, this is so revolutionary because it's such a simple idea of switching the narrative of who we are, and a really powerful way to just remember the mountains and the waters first. So I think getting outside of ourselves as individuals is what I would recommend.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you. And this question really takes off from the last question and the response that you were having about listening. And I was also thinking about how you started, Kim Gichi, if I'm pronouncing your name right. And you brought up the question of that when you stand, there were things from the past that were coming to you. And there was the other thing which was very kind of moving for me when you said that when you were talking to the community there, for them, oceans always brought spirits from these different places to the Swahili coast. So again, that was about a past, that was about a history, that was about a mobility. So this question of the history and the past of the waters in which you were standing is of course very much tied to what you're trying to bring attention to, right, in terms of the crises of the climate, which follows from the history of colonialism, capitalism, so on. So I kind of want to hear a little bit that in these various sites, if there were uncomfortable stories and exchanges, questions for which simple answers were not there. The simple image, in a way, was an antithesis to that complex history. And I would love both of you to kind of comment on that from your own subjective positions. And if there were tough questions and difficult personal questions related to race, related to colonialism, related to these spirits coming through the oceans, but also extractive powers coming through the oceans, right? So I love the story of the Maori making the land and the water and the mountains, how they inverse that, but that is again then inflected by another history, there's a lot between those two times as well. So I would love to hear something about those, kind of non-answers. Because I feel that when I read the resilience volume as well, and we discussed a lot in our class, that what would it be to have a volume talk even more about process, or failures of process, or experiments that did not go forward, or places where standing in water did not go forward. And what would it mean to think through a crisis through performances that could not take place, right? So you get a sense of, it would be lovely to get a texture of those stories and those pasts from both of you.
Do you want to start?
Actually, during that performance, I came across a story of the origin of that community that was calling itself Shirazi. From the name, they assume the Arabs, but you don't see any evidence that the Arabs. But that purely has like some kind of identity crisis they were facing. The slave trade that was going on, if you are Muslim and Arab, you will not be picked as a slave. So you had to pretend you have Arab origin in order to survive. But then again, you had to negotiate and also be able to deal with the Africans who are living there. So this, the Shirazi people who we were working with, like the very ones who are close to the coast, have this trouble with who they are up to this very moment, because of that confusion that emanated from interaction with these communities and slavery. They could have easily been taken as slaves, but they had to say, we are Muslims, so therefore we cannot be taken as slaves. So they still suffer from that identity problem up to this very moment. And now that they were interacting with, we had two communities, I don't know whether you noticed, but the ones who live slightly far from the ocean were the original inhabitants, and then the ones close to the ocean. So the ones who were doing the ritual performance were the Diko people who were the original occupiers of the land. The ones who were close to the ocean, Muslims too, like the Diko, but were saying of Arab origin. So you can see people still suffering from that sense of loss of identity and searching for it. It inspired for me to write a paper about that confusion of just who they are and how they're constructing their identities from narratives picked from different people. You say, I came from here, I came from that, but they say that is what the ocean does, that it gives you that fluid sense of identity that you don't seem to identify anything. So that was for me very problematic, and we had to bring those two communities together into that whole performance, one doing a different thing and another one doing something else.
Yeah, and I mean, there's lots of stories that I could share with you. I think it was first when I was going to Bangladesh where it, you know, maybe it was my naivete of just, you know, thinking of myself as a global citizen before that. But when I was in Bangladesh, that first of just realizing like, oh, what does it mean to be this white body, white woman doing this work here? And we actually considered having someone else do it, but no one wanted to do it. And so, but that conversation came into play, and recognizing what that means to be a white woman going into this space. And then also having, and then there were definitely experiences of discomfort in that, too long to go into, but I will, and that carried through actually in all the locations. And the one of the emergent themes was really the trauma of white settler colonialism. And I don't know, you know, like now if I was starting another project like this, I don't know that I would say, let's do this all around the world, even though my collaborators are so dear to me, and I would not want to ever lose them. I think in some ways that choice was, you know, in a very particular moment in time in 2013, and maybe now I would make a different choice. But have learned so much from that. And the biggest thing is about listening and just you know, really trying to make it. You know, I started talking about when referring to myself in the video artwork, I'd be like, okay, so the red dress has to be in the shot. It's not me. It's just the red dress. The red dress is this like is actually the symbol of a human in this space. And in many ways, you know, when the work began, I didn't necessarily, when I had the idea, didn't necessarily intend it to be myself. And so in some ways, I'm very uncomfortable with the fact that it's me, but it is, I've learned that it's also really good to actually have created this thing and then actually to walk out and let go and not be on the shore controlling everything that happens, because I would be really controlling it if because I am a director by background, and so there's something very valuable in actually like stepping out there and letting go of control completely, and letting my collaborators actually be fully in charge of what happens on that day. But yeah, we can go into that more later if you want.
Maybe just one small thing. I think since you mentioned the issue of process, I think now when you mentioned the one when you're thinking about drama, and like a protagonist, like she had to undergo, you had so many obstacles to negotiate, especially when you're dealing with a community. You're coming in with an art, they are not so sure what it means. Like I'm just thinking, her red dress means different things to different communities. In the Diko community, that is the color of spirits. So it was easily interpreted like that. But the ones who are Muslims were saying, we don't deal with spirits like this, so we don't want songs sung in that context. So there were almost all kinds of negotiations that were done within that. So you could see, even before the final, if you were to film the whole drama of dealing with the community before you going even in the water, it's a whole series of so many negotiations and deals that one has to strike before it finally ended.
And letting, actually that part of listening is letting the communities be in charge of the choices that are made. So it is, and that's also a thing, is that each work in the series is very distinct. The only thing that remains really is that on the day that we've decided, I walk out at low tide and I stand there and then I walk back, you know, but everything else is different. And so that is, yeah. And so much of it is about what everything occurs because of choices that come through with the people I'm working with.
Hi, I have a very, very old grandmother who has major thalassophobia, like she hates the ocean, she's terrified of it. And when I told her that I was going to be doing this and you were going to be doing this, she was very concerned and upset and very, very terrified for you. And even though I don't have thalassophobia, I totally get it. And so my question to you is, having spoken with the water for so many hours, is there anything about the ocean that scared you, or is there anything currently that scares you about the ocean?
Oh yeah, I'm kind of terrified of the ocean. I'm really glad that I'm not too far in, because there's a lot of unknown things. And so I've kind of come to, I sort of feel safer just being still and letting whatever happen around me. There's something that, to me, like, that's much safer actually than swimming. Because I just become part of the water, or I become, yeah, in it in a different way. I'm stable. So yeah, I think that there's, yes, it's scary, and we must figure out how to be with the ocean and embody her in a different way. So that's the attempt. That's what I'm attempting to do.
Actually, one of the things that I've been wanting to say or to bring up connects with your question. And it has to do with the question of environmental politics or activism. You know, we were talking about some of the words that come up for us around this work: endurance, exhaustion, wonder, bewilderment. The words that don't come up, but I think are very, that haven't come up yet, very important to now begin to center in environmental politics and eco-activism, are the words suffering and care. Because that's what we're not talking about. You know, we keep talking about energy and so forth, but what's really facing us is extraordinary and unpredictable forms of suffering. And so in some ways, the politics that are most urgently needed are a politics of different kinds of care. And I must say, one of the things I've always loved most about your performance is the person who comes and brings you water. You know, and it's just part of that whole surrounding structure that's created. So we have come to the end of our time, and before I actually just wanted to say, I wrote this down because I want to make sure I get it right. During each performance of 36.5, Sarah creates a living memorial to courage, resilience, and ecospheric awareness. These qualities are vital to our current condition. But what she does before each performance, and what she's done by staging each one in a different part of the world, is, I think, even more important. She's offered the beginnings of an answer to one of the big questions we have to face, which is, and this is related to Deepti's question, how can we meet the need for unified action that the climate crisis demands when we are so deeply divided by vastly unequal histories of domination and dispossession? So I think in its 9 years, 36.5 has been rehearsing some of the values and practices and skills that we must develop if we're going to come together and connect across difference. Humility and respect, self-awareness and alertness to our cultural and ideological blind spots, genuine openness and deep listening, patience and generosity. Sarah has rehearsed these skills with 9 different groups of collaborators. We who've watched and joined and thought and taught and written about this work are part of that rehearsal and that thrilling learning. So I ask you now to join me in thanking Sarah and her partner, the sea, for 36.5.